Hello everyone, it's Cameron and welcome to another video. Today we're going to do an album review. Today's a very special album review because 60 years ago this week, on the 22nd to be exact, the Beatles released their second album titled With the Beatles, and even 5 years later they would release the White Album on the same day, 1968. So in this album I'm going to go over the album's history, what was happening with the Beatles at this time, show you my copies of the album, go over each track individually and give the album as a whole a marking out of 10. So With the Beatles was the Beatles' second album on Parlophone, released on the 22nd of November 1963. 1963 had been a very busy year for the Beatles. They'd had their first number ones, which was From Me to You, in the April of 1963. They were doing a lot of touring, appearing on bills with people like Chris Montez, Roy Orbison, and even appearing headlining their own shows as well in the 60s. And they were on like TV, radio. So Beatlemania by 1963 was really in its full swing. But the Beatles still owed another album because the Please Please Me album was still number one in the charts at the time. And so at the time, pop acts would normally put out an album, 2 albums a year, and then maybe a few singles. So the Beatles had recorded their fourth single, She Loves You, and its B-side, I'll Get You, in the July of 1963, and it was released a month later and it went to number one. And so their first album had 2 singles already recorded at the point, and they were recorded most of it in one day. But with the second one, which took months to make, they started recording the album on July the 18th, 1963, and they would record it whenever they had like days off in between their touring and television and radio schedule as well. So they really were everywhere about the country by 1963, and they continued to work on the album throughout August and September and into October of 1963, and it was eventually complete and mixed and eventually released in November. And in between that, the Beatles had appeared on the Royal Variety Show. They even went on their first tour in Sweden as well, which was the first tour outside of the UK, and they really were like everywhere in the summer of 63 and touring a lot. And so yeah, the album was released on the 22nd, it reached number 1 on the UK charts, perhaps no surprise, and it actually overtook their first album, Please Please Me. Their first album, Please Please Me, by this point had been number 1 for 30 weeks, and then when With the Beatles came along, it overtook Please Please Me from the number 1 album spot. So yeah, the Beatles were kind of dominating the charts by this point as well, and even reached number 11 on the singles chart, because at the time, the singles were still like the format that people in the 60s were kind of buying their music on. They couldn't really get much for an album, but then again, you know, but there. So yeah, as I say, that's kind of the history of what's happened with the Beatles at this point. Here's my copies of the album. This is an original mono pressing from 1963, which is very good to have. There's the songs and tracks. Much like their first album, this album has covers, but it has a few original songs. It has 8 original songs from John and Paul or George, and it has 6 covers. And so yeah, and this is the here's the vinyl. It's on Parlophone, as I say, and there's the record. Black and yellow label. I think this might be a second pressing because it's got the Dominion credit for Money at the bottom, whereas first pressings have the Joe Beat credit for Money. I might be right or I could be wrong, but I do think there is that is probably a probability. But yeah, this copy plays really well for its age, which is good. I found this one at my record shop a year ago for about £15, I think, which was pretty good for this album. So yeah, there's that one. And then I have the Stereo 2012 version, which was my first ever vinyl copy of it. When I was just kind of getting into the Beatles, this was the one I got. It's very identical, but it's a bit kind of, it's a little bit brighter in colour. But I've got to say, first of all, the cover art. I really love this picture of the Beatles. It's a great picture of them in sort of black and white, and one of my favourite album covers as well. As you can see, it's a bit more brighter. You can see a bit more of the other Beatles, so there we are. It's very identical apart from the fold over corners, and we're still on the yellow Parlophone label. It's on like 180 gram kind of black vinyl. There it is. As you can see, they're very, very identical. And I'm going to show you my CDs. I've got 2 CDs. Here's the first one. This is from the Stereo 2009 box set. They've changed the back a bit, but it's got a nice picture of the back of them there. Inside there, the CD comes out like that, and it's much like the vinyl. And here is the booklet. The book, I really like these booklets because they all have like a lot of nice pictures of the Beatles from around about the era. They have the album liner notes as well. Even mentions the recordings, how they recorded it, and what that's one of my favourite pictures of the Beatles, actually, that one. And what they were kind of going through, and just kind of the time frame of what was happening with them. That's the stereo CD. And I also have the mono from the 2009 mono box, which I also have. Again, what looks much like my vinyl version, I would say. So yeah, so that one. And then also around about this time, the Beatles made it in America, because in the past, like the American, they had released stuff in America before, but they didn't really chart. They were on like small labels. But then eventually when they got to Capitol with the release of I Want to Hold Your Hand and I Saw Her Standing There, they eventually hit it big in America and went to America in February of 1964. So that was a big point there. And then this album had come out, Meet the Beatles. This is the American version of With the Beatles, but a few tracks have been switched and changed. Like there's not much cover. The cover tracks have been taken off, but you do get Till There Was You on there and replaced with originals, and you even get I Saw Her Standing There and I Want to Hold Your Hand and This Boy, the UK single, which was released a week after With the Beatles, which we'll show in a while. This is a stereo, 1976 on the orange Capitol label pressing. And this is the Beatles' second album, which was released a few months later in America. This has like the cover with the Beatles and a few added songs as well. Again, this is a stereo, and it's on the Apple label. This is an Apple 70s pressing. But yeah, good to have these, even though they're not the originals, because you know, it's a big collection as well. Okay, now we're going to go over all the album's songs in detail. So, we have It Won't Be Long. This is a great way to open the album. I really like the way it starts with song, It Won't Be Long, yeah. And then Paul and George come in with the backing vocals as well. I really like the guitar, the beat to it. It's really like an up-tempo sort of song. Yeah, great way to start the album, I'd say. Great lyrics as well. It Won't Be Long. Yeah, really great song. Then we have All I've Got to Do. This is a really good sort of mid-tempo kind of song. I really like the beat to it, the boom, tss, boom, tss, to it, and this is a great sort of nice little mid-tempo kind of song. Lyrics are really good as well. John sings them brilliantly. Paul and George even help with backing vocals as well. So yeah, really, really great one as well. All I've Got to Do. Then we have All My Loving. Now, All My Loving it was never a hit single. I don't think it was ever released as a single, but it has become a sort of staple within the Beatles catalogue, and it's a favourite amongst Beatles fans. And there was never a single issued from this album, because the Beatles had a thing that they never really took singles off an album, at least in Britain. But in America, some companies did that with other artists, but the Beatles never really did that. But All My Loving was issued as the title track of an EP in 1964, in February 1964. And this is my EP copy of it, mono, with All My Loving, Ask Me Why from Please Please Me on side 1, with Money from With the Beatles, and P.S. I Love You from Please Please Me. So that's a great one. But All My Loving's a great one. It's one that Paul McCartney has played live during the years in his solo tours. It's one that Paul sings with backing from George and John, and it's really a great sort of up-tempo song with the guitar as well in the middle from George, and yeah, a great one, All My Loving from with the Beatles, and it's one that appeared 10 years later on the Beatles' Red Album in 1960. The Beatles' Red Album 1962 to 1966 in 1973. So yeah, must have been good enough to include it on that. But yeah, it's definitely a favourite amongst Beatles fans. All My Loving. Then we have Don't Bother Me. Now this, Don't Bother Me, is not a Lennon and McCartney composition. This is a George Harrison written song. And this is the first one that George Harrison wrote. The first song he ever wrote. He wrote it when the Beatles were on tour in Bournemouth in August 1963, and George wasn't very well. He was in bed in the hotel, and it was just like him writing this song, and just kind of passed the time. And he kind of started to think, well, if John and Paul can write good songs, then maybe I'll give it a go. So he wrote Don't Bother Me, and it's a really good first song to write. And it's really a great one. I really like the sort of percussion, the drums, and the kind of guitar, and George's vocal. George takes the lead vocal on this track for this song. But yeah, it's a great one there. Don't Bother Me. One of my favourite sort of Beatle album tracks and lesser known kind of Beatles songs. So yeah, great one. Then we have Little Child. Little Child's a good one. I like the sort of harmonica start to the song, and starts the track, and it kicks in with the piano and the drums, and then John begins to sing, and Paul does a bit of harmony as well, backing vocals as well. And Paul plays piano on this track, as it says on the liner notes in the back, and it's a really good song. I like it. Then we have Till There Was You. Now, Till There Was You was not. This is one of the covers. I think it was a hit for Peggy Lee, and Paul McCartney sings this one, and he sings this one very well. And it was one that the Beatles would do. I don't think they ever did this live that often, but you can hear versions on like the live at the BBC and the BBC stuff. And they did perform it on the Ed Sullivan Show as well, in one of their Ed Sullivan shows in 1964. So yeah, it was one that they would include in their set, and based on like their set list from the time in '63, they did perform it based on the set list that have surfaced from this tour. Even if no recordings have surfaced, the Beatles did play it live in the BBC a few times before they recorded it in the studio, and even times after they recorded it in Abbey Road and released it on an album. Then we have Please Mr. Postman. Please Mr. Postman was originally by the Marvelettes in 1961, and this is one of a few kind of soul influenced songs that the Beatles did, because the Beatles had quite a love for soul and American black music and kind of Motown, and there's a couple of Motown songs in here which we'll touch upon later on. But yeah, this is a great one. John sings it real well, both Paul and George taking backing vocals as well. Alright, the way it starts with the kind of sound, which is kind of a distinctive sound, and the Beatles would use that kind of sound for some of their records as well, in the 60s as well, these kind of hand clap sounds. Yeah, Marvelettes. It features John and Paul and George singing, and this was a big favourite of mine. That track dates back to their Cavern Club periods. It was one that they used to play a lot when they're in the cavern, and there's even a version of it where they played it on the BBC radio, and there's a version from June 1962 with Pete Best on drums. And the quality of that's not brilliant, but it's kind of interesting to listen to for like historical kind of interest, but maybe you wouldn't really want to listen to it sort of. It's kind of interesting to listen to it. It's a curio type of thing, even if the quality's not good. But anyway, this was a favourite cover Beatles version of mine, one that I kind of would listen to quite a lot when I started getting into the Beatles, and this was a favourite of mine, this version of Please Mr. Postman. And later the Carpenters had a hit with it in the 1970s, so yeah, a great one. Now we turn over to side 2 with Roll Over Beethoven, another great way to start off the second side. It's a really good upbeat one. This one is sung by George, and it's a cover version of a Chuck Berry song. Now Chuck Berry was, for those who don't know, was a rock and roller from like the 50s and 60s, and the Beatles were big Chuck Berry fans. They did a lot of his songs on stage, and this is one that they did on their albums. And Roll Over Beethoven's a great one. George is a great one of this. One that the Beatles did in concert a lot. And there's like hand clapping kind of adds to the excitement of it a bit, and it's a really great one for this album to do. Roll Over Beethoven, great one. Then we have Hold Me Tight, one sung by Paul, backing from John and George again. Now this was a song that the Beatles had attempted to do during the sessions for Please Please Me in February 1963, but they were never satisfied with it, and it didn't make the final album, and they shelved the track. But then eventually, when it came time to record with the Beatles, they went back and they revisited it, but they changed the tempo a bit. I heard that the original version was a different key, but I have no idea because the session tapes for that that track the recording doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately. But they did go back and re-record for the second album, which was good. They did that so that it was never sort of forgotten. We now have it here, and this is a great one. This is a great one. Look at the hand clap. It's a good upbeat, up-tempo tune. Great one. That's a good one. I like it. Then we have You Really Got a Hold on Me. This is one that Paul, George and John sing, and this was originally, I think from the credit, a Smokey Robinson song. And Smokey Robinson was of course a Motown artist, and the Beatles, as I said, had a good love and influence of and the Motown kind of had an influence on the Beatles a bit in the 60s. They loved a lot of those American black music from the 60s, like a lot of people, and it's a really good one. And George Martin, their producer, plays piano on this track. And George Martin would collaborate a few instruments on some of their songs as well. And so yeah, this is probably I'm right in thinking this might be the... No, actually, I tell a lie. George Martin did piano on Misery and did Celeste on Baby It's You for the Please Please Me album in 1963. So this is like the second time George Martin kind of collaborates to something, and George Martin plays piano on this track, and a really good song. I really like the version of You Really Got a Hold of Me. It's not one that I would listen to kind of outside the album, but still one that I like a lot. Then we have I Wanna Be Your Man. I Wanna Be Your Man is sung by Ringo and is a Lennon and McCartney composition. This was one that they gave to the Rolling Stones and became the Rolling Stones' first #1, who the Rolling Stones were a group that were just kind of starting off at this point in time as well. And but they do a good job with this one, I Want to Be Your Man. And I like both the Stones and the Beatles versions of I Want to Be Your Man, so yeah, I can pick both. But a really great one, I Want to Be Your Man. This has John, I think, helping him and backing him as well, and John and Paul as well, much like Boys from the first album, Please Please Me. And I think, according to the liner notes, John Lennon plays Hammond organ in the background as well. So yeah, the Beatles all did different kind of instruments as well in their recordings, as well as guitars and whatnot. So yeah, they're the good sort of, yeah, great one, I Want to Be Your Man. Then we have Devil in Her Heart. Now, Devil in Her Heart was from an American girl group. I think the Donnays. It was from the Donnays, a group called the Donnays, but their version was called There's a Devil in His Heart, but the Beatles kind of changed the lyrics to Devil in Her Heart. And there's a couple of they did this a couple of times on the BBC, Radio BBC, in 1963, because there's a couple of releases from that, from the live at the BBC type of things. So yeah, this is a good one. George Harrison does the lead vocal in this one, but Paul and George provide the backing and harmony as well, and Ringo plays maracas as well as the drums as well. So yeah, great one. And also Don't Bother Me has a bongo as well, played by Ringo as well. So yeah, they kind of use different methods of instruments from this one. Yeah, really great one. Then we have Not a Second Time. Now, Not a Second Time is one of my favourites of this album. It's a great one sung by John. I think it's just John, but George Martin plays piano and Ringo on the drums, and I think Paul and George run the bass and guitar. So yeah, it's a really great one, Not a Second Time. I like the lyrics, I like the John's vocal performance. I really like the music to this one. A really good song. Yeah, one that I like a lot. Then we come to the album's closer with Money, That's What I Want. Money, That's What I Want was originally a song by Barrett Strong. And again, this, much like the Please Mr. Postman, was one that they used to play a lot in the Cavern Club days, and played a lot when they were like a small band. And so they played it a lot, and like and they even continued to play it on like the BBC radio as well, when they were like doing the BBC radio appearances as well. And it kind of similar to Twist and Shout, it's like a good rock and roller to close off their album. Which Twist and Shout closed Please Please Me. Now this one closes with the second one. So yeah, really great one. And John gives a great vocal performance, much like Twist and Shout, and Paul and George help him with it. And yeah, and Money, That's What I Want's also been covered by loads of people. The Everly Brothers did it on their Beat and Soul album in 1965, and Roy Orbison later did it on the Big O album in 1970. So, a great one. And the Beatles did this live as well in the 60s as well for a period. There's a version on like It's the Beatles TV special from the BBC. They played that one there on 1963. So yeah, they played this song a lot live over the course of over their touring career for a period. So yeah, it's a great way to end the album. And even in the line notes by their press agent Tony Barrow, it says, Money makes a completely worthy climax to this knockout programme. Hope it doesn't leave you too breathless to flip back to side one for a replete play session with the Beatles. Yeah, I quite like that wee line note. So, With the Beatles overall is a 10 out of 10 album. It is a great album, and it kind of shows you that Beatlemania was really in full swing and was really doing going places because they just did the Sunday Night at London Palladium appearance, and that was where the kind of term came from. For those that sort of don't know where that term Beatlemania came from, it was from that, where the papers kind of described as the fans waiting to see the show as like Beatlemania. And then the week after this album, the Beatles would release the single I Want to Hold Your Hand. It would become their third #1 single, or fourth, whatever one you want to go for. And the B-side was This Boy, which is one of my favourite songs from that. And that was done during the sessions for With the Beatles in October of 1963. And then when I Want to Hold Your Hand with I Saw Her Standing There came out in America a few weeks later on the Capitol label with I Saw Her Standing There as the B-side, Beatlemania had hit America. And then the Beatles went to America, appeared in the Ed Sullivan Show. And so, yeah, it was really kind of, they were just breaking big in Britain. They made it big in Britain, but now they were going to break it big in America. Little were they to know that they were to make it big in America, and then appear in like their film A Hard Day's Night, and then tour America as well. But that'll be a video for another topic, for another time when we do. That'll probably be when we do A Hard Day's Night in July, for the 60th anniversary in July. So yeah, yeah, definitely one of my favourite albums. It's one of my favourite second albums. I like both and Please Please Me equally. Much like, but which one would I prefer? Well, it's hard to say. It's hard to say which one out of the two I would prefer the most, but they're both great. Much like I would say that I like both Elvis's debut and Elvis's second one, Rock and Roll Number 2. But I like both. I like both in some cases. And Mika, The Boy Who Knew Too Much. Again, like his debut, Life in Cartoon Motion, and The Boy Who Knew Too Much, which was his second one. So yeah, that's all I've got for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you like this album, leave a comment below, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you again for the next video. Until then, bye just now.